on behalf of the Center for Nonviolent Solutions. We are a small nonprofit in the city of Worcester that engages in peace education. And before I get too deep into tonight's program, I'm gonna just do a couple of housekeeping requests. We have all of you muted, and we're asking that you stay muted throughout the presentation. We do have a PowerPoint and a video, and so please, if you could stay muted, and then there'll be opportunity to ask questions of our speakers afterward. This center is a small nonprofit here in Worcester, Massachusetts, with the ambitious mission of peace education. We have a number of different programs and initiatives that we're involved in, but one that has developed over the course of COVID, thanks to Zoom, are monthly presentations that showcase active nonviolence. One knowledge gap that we experience as peace builders is that people have a vague understanding of what peace is. It's kind of a cloudy, feel good association. And we would like to really show examples of how peace building is applied to a variety of areas of human struggle. Past programs have included a presentation on warheads to windmills, and this is looking at our nuclear arsenal and how the US could pivot from nuclear arms production to green energy. So the presenter gave a report on that. We had a presentation from the Nonviolent Peace Force, who is the largest unarmed civilian peacekeeping force in the world, and they work in conflict zones in South Sudan, they've worked in Iraq, and now actually they were working also in Minneapolis. So they talked about their approaches. We had a group discussing that presented on their efforts to bring progressives from Western Massachusetts to meet with Trump supporters in Appalachia, and the dialogue and relationships that evolved between those two communities. Tonight, we're very, very pleased to have Mr. Michael Lawrence Riddell and Mr. Bayete Ross Smith. And Mr. Ross Smith, are you coming in from Harlem? Because we have Mr. Lawrence Riddell is over in Western Mass, but are you in NYC right now?
Yes, I'm in Harlem. I'm at Columbia, so we, native New Yorkers like myself always joke that in the Columbia area they try to call it Morningside Heights, and they don't want to call it Harlem, but we're like, it's Harlem. You're across 110th Street.
No, I know exactly of where you speak. I know, and it's a wonderful area. So a little bit about our speakers tonight, and the format will be after I introduce, I'm going to completely give the mic to them, and we're gonna let them speak and do their presentation for 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up to some questions and answers from the audience and from myself. And to let everybody know, we are recording. This is some people who couldn't make it tonight will have an opportunity to see this presentation later. And you can see previous talks at the center's website, which is very simple, nonviolentsolutions.org. You can access it. So a little bit about our speakers. Mr. Lawrence Riddell is an award-winning public educator from Western Massachusetts with over 20 years of classroom experience. So that in itself is quite an acclaim. He conceived self-evident education in response to the urgent need to examine the history and legacies of race and institutional racism in the US. Michael was inspired in part by his studies as an African-American studies major at Wesleyan University, and his work as a teacher of American History 1, and his continued witnessing of the failures of our nation to truly reckon with the racial inequities present in history and our contemporary society. He wanted to teach the history of this nation through the lens of the creation of power and race as a tool of power. He wanted to communicate in the cultural language that students understand, a multimedia lexicon. When he saw that these two areas were lacking, he decided to create his own curriculum. Mr. Bayete Ross Smith is an interdisciplinary artist, photographer, filmmaker, and educator who works at the intersection of photography, film and video, visual journalism, 3D objects, and new media. He lives in Harlem, also known as Morningside Heights, New York, Columbia Law School's inaugural artist in residence. He has received many awards and fellowships for his artistry. His work is in the collection at Smithsonian Institution, the Oakland Museum of California, the Birmingham Museum of Art, the Schoenberg Center for Research in Black Culture, the Brooklyn Museum. He's exhibited internationally in numerous locales, and I am editing the remarkable bio on the different art museums where he's exhibited. But he's also contributed to public art projects with organizations such as the Jerome Foundation, Brick Arts Media, Amistad Center, the Laundromat Project, and New York City Parks. What's remarkable is that in addition to this creative work in art, Mr. Ross Smith has also helped to work and to launch and continues to work with Kings Against Violence Initiative, a hospital and school-based violence prevention organization in Brooklyn, New York, that partners with Kings County Hospital. He is a faculty member at New York University's Tisch School of the Arts. Before I turn the mic over, so one might say, what does history have to do with peace building? But so often in working in circumstances of conflict, it is the differing histories that help to really keep the conflict going. To quote my grandmother, who was probably quoting somebody else, one half of the world doesn't know how the other half lives. And when they don't know each other's story, then they're shocked at each other's perceptions and reactions. They're just almost speaking different languages. So we really want to reckon with our history as American people. And that's what Mr. Lawrence Riddell and Mr. Ross Smith are going to encourage and show us how they're doing that. And we're so, so pleased to have them. So I give the mic to both of you.
Claire, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, everybody, for having us. I am honored and blessed to be here with my friend and brother of many decades, Bayete Ross Smith. It's an honor to get to roll with you in this work, sir. And thank you all for having us here to talk with you about the work that we're doing. So, Bayete, unless you have any, launching words, I'll get right into the slideshow.
The only thing is I appreciate you as always, Mike, and I appreciate this entire group for taking the time to be with us tonight. It can seem like a little thing, but it's a little and very important step, if anything. It's building that inertia behind these kinds of movements. So I'm appreciative for everyone taking time out of their busy lives to spend this evening with us.
Ditto. I second that. All right, so let's tell you a little bit about the work that we're doing at Self-Evident, and then we'll share with you just one example of the library of resources that we're building. So the power of corrective and connective histories, engaging with the past to understand the present and build a just future. And so for us, in all of the work that we do in Self-Evident, in so much of the work that Bayete does in his own work, we're looking at the ways in which the past informs the present, informs the future. And we really believe in this idea that if we don't accurately understand and assess our past, we can't accurately analyze our present, which enables us which makes us unable to envision, much less build a just future. And so, that's sort of encapsulated in this beautiful James Baldwin quotation. I think that the past is all that makes the present coherent, and further, that the past will remain horrible for exactly as long as we refuse to assess it honestly. And so that's what we're here to try to do, is to do some honest assessment of our past. And like Claire said, this mission began with my work in the classroom, with wanting to present stories to my students in the history classroom that would help them to understand the ways in which systemic racism has functioned in the United States, and the ways that violence has been a central tool of that project of white supremacy and systemic racism. I have an amazing board of directors and founding advisory board who has helped me in this work. Bayate, was, as soon as I conceived of this idea, Bayate was the first person that I called. And so, the work of Bayate's mind and my mind are sort of really enmeshed in the DNA of this project. We're going to show you an episode that Bayate and I worked on together. We co-wrote together. We co-hosted it. We sort of worked on it at every level to make sure that this was doing justice to the tough story that we were trying to tell. And it's about the 1921 race massacre in Tulsa, and it's called "What Happens to a Dream Destroyed." And so as we watch it, we want you to just sort of think about examining the ways in which violence has been a central facet of systemic racism in the United States. How did and do Black communities resist and respond to this systemic violence? And how did a lack of legal response serve to strengthen the systems of white supremacy? At moments in the episode, they're reflection points. They're designed for educators in educational contexts to take a pause in the video and allow their students or their audience to interact with it. In the interest of time, we're going to sort of burst through those quickly. I'll pause them for a second and I'll let people, throw their thoughts in the chat. Same way throughout the video, if you have thoughts that you want to share, or you have questions you want to share, throw them in the chat, and we'll try to get to those. And if we don't get to them right away, hopefully we'll get to them during the question and answer parts. Without further ado, we are pleased to present to you What Happens to a Dream Destroyed. The following content contains descriptions and images of racist violence and may not be suitable for younger audiences. Viewer discretion is advised. This history is hard, but critical to study.
I could hear something like hail falling upon the top of my office building. And then another and another and another building began to burn from their top.
I saw men and women fleeing for their lives. As one woman was running from her home, she suddenly fell with a bullet wound.
The planes, now a dozen or more in number. Lurid flames roared and belched and licked their forked tongues into the air. This is what I saw on June 1st, 1921.
Welcome to Self-Evident, where we take you deep into fascinating stories of American history and encourage you to critically examine the histories and the legacies of the creation and weaponization of race in the United States of America. Hello, everyone. I'm Mr. LR with my co-host.
Let's hit it.
Bayate.
Ross Smith.
You look down a little bit.
I noticed that at the end.
Yeah.
This episode is called
What Happens to a Dream Destroyed?
The Tulsa Massacre of 1921.
Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1921, just a few generations ago.
A rapidly growing city from just a few thousand people in 1900 to about 75,000 20 years later.
The nation had just witnessed the horrors of 1917 and the Red Summer of 1919, a period of extreme terrorist violence directed towards Black communities.
While white supremacist ideology was on the rise, in places like Tulsa, Black residents were building their futures, building their dreams.
There was a lot of money coming in and out of the city because of the oil business and because of World War I.
On leaving the Frisco station going north to Archer Street, one could see nothing but Negro business places.
Mary E. Jones Parrish lived in Tulsa during the early 1900s.
Going east on Archer Street, you would behold Greenwood Avenue, the Negroes' Wall Street. This section of Tulsa was a city within a city.
May 30th, 1921, there was a young Black man and a young white woman were on an elevator together. She was operating the elevator. He was a passenger.
19-year-old shoeshiner Dick Rowland was the passenger, and 17-year-old Sarah Page, an elevator operator.
Something happened on the elevator. We don't know exactly what. She screamed and he ran away.
The next day, Dick Rowland was arrested and sent to the county jail. Local white-owned newspapers fanned the flames of a growing tension.
As often happened in cases involving a white woman and a Black man, rumors of a planned lynching began.
They're trying to lynch our comrade without cause and law defy. Get your guns and help defend him. Let's protect him, win or die.
In his poem, newspaper publisher A.J. Smitherman described the invasion like this.
June the 1st at 5 a.m. 3 long whistle blasts were heard, giving sign for concert action to that cold, bloodthirsty herd. Like true soldiers that they were, Black men faced the lawless white men under duty's urgent spur.
They held off the white invasion of Greenwood until they were simply overwhelmed.
You think most people know about this history of Tulsa, Oklahoma? Why or why not? What questions do you still want answers to?
I think Mike is muted.
My bad, my bad.
This is a point where we would pause and the students would be able to reflect. One of the things we've built into the resources with Self-Evident is concise scenes at these reflection points with other young people who are about the age of the students who would be experiencing these materials, kind of modeling a thoughtful reflection based on what they've seen so far and those key questions at that point.
Yep, exactly. And so if everybody could take, maybe 30 seconds, a minute, if you have thoughts, throw them in the chat. If not, just sort of, ruminate on your thoughts internally before we hear from some students and then see the end. Who led the core group of whites that moved to attack the Black community? It's a great question from John Morosi, and the answer to that, I think, is not 100% knowable or verifiable because so much was done to bury that history. But the fact that it happened and happened all at once in an organized and concerted way, really clearly points to a good deal of organizing that happened. A lot of the men on the side of the invading white forces were World War I veterans, similarly to a lot of the men who assembled to protect the Black community were also World War I veterans. In fact, one of the sort of moments that's pointed to as one of the inciting incidents is when there's a Black man who is armed, and a white man is attempting to take his gun away from him, and the gun goes off, and then sort of mayhem ensues from there. We'll see in the second scene also that there were airplanes, flying over the city of Tulsa, and varying reports from survivors of the massacre of incendiary devices being dropped from those airplanes onto the community, shots being fired out of those airplanes into the community, and you can just imagine the terror when a community is burning of seeing airplanes flying overhead, regardless of whether or not they're dropping bombs. But yeah, bye, Tay.
It's also important to remember at this time, a substantial portion of the time, people who were in official positions in government, in law enforcement, in policy, in politics, in important civic institutions were also members of the Klan. So the Klan is intertwined with many of the daily functions of US government at this time. So it could not officially be the Klan, but be Klan influenced. And it's important to understand that there's not that level of separation, and that's, perfectly acceptable to a large extent. Not always, but to a large extent.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that happened that we dig into in the follow-up curriculum and didn't have time to really get into the nuances of it in this story is they deputized a lot of white citizens. The police force in Tulsa deputized white citizens on this night, and they armed them, and they gave them the job of maintaining order. And what that maintenance of order turned into was attacks on the Black community. All right, let me get this queued up, and we'll get back in here, and we will see how. And I'm just gonna for the second reflection point, I'm just gonna let it go through so that we have time at the end for more questions and answers.
Yeah. Well, one moment, Mike. I want to clarify one of the questions. Was there ever any follow-up on the incident? Can you elaborate on what you mean by follow-up? I think you mean like a legal investigation by law enforcement, but I want to be certain that I'm understanding that. No, there wasn't really follow-up on the elevator because Sarah Page refused to press charges, and then the massacre kind of took precedence over authorities ever investigating the elevator incident. My understanding is Dick Rowland after that stayed in jail for several months, maybe even over the summer, and Sarah Page eventually went back to work. But they were both still alive after the massacre.
Yep. All right. Play. Oh. Do you think we already heard these?
In 1921, it still connects to this day and time, especially with the police officers, because there was one part where it talked about how the officers, instead of detaining the white people as well, they aided with them and detained the Black people.
It was so hidden to the fact to where nobody even really talks about it these days. It's not in a lot of books. It's not really out there that much. I don't even learn about it in history classes. It's something that was only introduced to me in poetry.
The evening being a pleasant one, my little girl had not retired, but was watching the people from the window.
Mother, I see men with guns.
Then I ran to the window and looked out. I was told of the threatened lynching and that some of our group were going to give added protection to the boy.
A point of pride for Black Greenwood residents is that They held off the growing numbers of whites who had weapons, who were shooting into the community. But when 5 o'clock hit,
3 long whistle blasts were heard.
in one fell swoop entered.
A reported 10,000 white people in unison
Who had stationed themselves strategically around the district,
stormed into Greenwood, set on destruction.
I saw men and women fleeing for their lives. As one woman was running from her home, she suddenly fell with a bullet wound.
We saw 4 men with torches in their hand. They set our house on fire and went right straight to the curtains and set the curtains on fire.
Everything was burnt, you know. Everything.
You saw your grandfather get shot?
I saw you get shot. Bam.
and at that point, those courageous men who had defended the community were either killed or detained.
At the signal from the whistle, aeroplanes were seen to fly, dropping bombs and high explosives. Hell was falling from the sky.
As they passed over the business district, they left the entire block a mass of flame.
Within 12 hours, the entire Greenwood section of Tulsa was destroyed.
On reaching the house, I saw my piano and all of my elegant furniture piled in the street.
Piles of bricks, ashes, and twisted iron, representing years of toil and savings.
All of the money stolen, also my silverware, cut glass, and even my family Bible.
Family heirlooms, promises, hopes, and dreams and independence destroyed. Future wealth destroyed.
For blocks, we bowed our heads in silent grief and tried to blot out the frightful scenes that were ahead of us.
How can a community recover from a trauma like that which happened in Tulsa? Why is it important that we learn about this over 100 years after it happened?
Who wants to know that their grandfathers committed atrocities like that? Like, I can understand that, but at the same time, you can't hide the world from the atrocities that your grandfathers had committed, because, you know, we gotta learn from our mistakes.
Like, there's this stuff all over the internet. What happened 100 years ago? Stuff like that pops up when you look it up on the internet, and it's really like having to delve deep into the problem of what happened 100 years ago. You wouldn't have known.
It was a community lynching. We should move away from race riot and really talk about it only as a massacre, because the visual evidence is so compelling. The reason why there are so many photographs is because white Tulsans were really anxious to document their role in it. White Tulsans created postcards that they sent to relatives, that they sent to friends, to sort of celebrate this massacre. This postcard says, "Running the Negro out of Tulsa." This photo here captures whites posing in front of destroyed Greenwood buildings, homes, you know, almost in a gloating fashion. These are the kinds of things that the photographs make self-evident. The most important legacy is how Black residents in Greenwood rebuilt.
Yes, sir. Legacy, legacy, legacy.
In a very short period of time.
They rebuilt because this was their home. Why would they leave?
They didn't teach this in Oklahoma for 70 years. It was obliterated from the official records.
Sleep on, brave souls. May God give peace to your ashes. A.J. Smith.
you can't undo that by simply acknowledging that it happened now. You have to bring a comparable level of attention to it.
What have we lost? What are we continuing to lose by not addressing this issue?
We were horror-stricken, but strangely, we could not shed a tear.
Your dreams, they don't just become deferred, they are destroyed.
Legacy, legacy, legacy. This one's for my family. I'm talking about CC and Killer. I'm talking about Jesse and Dre. I'm talking about Peaches and Shay. I'm talking about Aspen and Natty.
For so many years, survivors' voices have been ignored, they have been discredited. On the 100th anniversary of the race massacre, I think we need to believe the survivors.
Legacy, legacy, legacy.
As you consider everything that you just saw and heard, we want you to consider these essential questions. Why do you think this history has not been taught as an act of domestic terrorism?
These stories are home to me now.
What can we do with the knowledge about what happened in Tulsa?
I heard about it.
Where do you see the similarities between what happened in Tulsa in 1921 and what is happening in today's United States of America?
I heard about it.
Until next time, this has been and will continue to be self-evident.
Movie theaters gone, strapped for gone too. Now the only song fitting to be home is Swing Low, Sweet Chariots, Swing Low, Sweet Chariots, curve road to carry me. These stories are home to me now. I hear about these stories. Graffiti line concrete for Juneteenth, manifestos, and I'ma be sure to tell my son about it.
So one of the things that's also important to consider, and I think this, almost directly relates to the mission of nonviolent solutions that we're discussing tonight, is that, it's mentioned earlier in the episode that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a continuum. And so we see that if the issues that led to this violence in 1921, and then even going back to the Red Summer of 1919, or what happened in East St. Louis and Houston in 1917, and stretching back even further beyond that, if that had been dealt with 100 years ago, we wouldn't still be talking about it the way that we're talking about it today. We also see that the response of armed Black men going down to the courthouse was a direct response to previous violence. And by being more knowledgeable or thoughtful about how that previous violence impacted Black communities all around the country, there may have been things that law enforcement and the authorities could have done to try and preempt this particular act of violence, because there was a series of warning signs starting in 1917 prior to Tulsa. And then finally, if you think about some of the things that are happening today and some of the responses to violence that impacts African Americans on the part of the police, you think about what happened in Tulsa, and then you think about the death of Terrence Crutcher in Tulsa, and you start to see some connections, and it explains why Black Tulsans, Black Americans in other scenarios are distrusting of police, distrusting of authority. So part of what we are hoping to do with self-evident media education is help people make those connections so that you can understand, all right, these protests are happening related to police violence now. There's generational trauma and there's a history that is leading up to these moments. And so in the case of Tulsa, the recent protests that they had related to Terrence Crutcher were about Terrence Crutcher, but they were also about a larger and longer history. And I think that understanding allows us to think more productively, about what some potential solutions could be.
Yeah, thank you for that, Bayate. Claire, I think at this point we can we can hand it over to you if you have some questions, or we'll sort of let you facilitate, gathering questions from the group, as it were.
Yeah, first of all, thank you both for your work. I have 50,000 questions, but I don't want to dominate. I have a few to kick us off here, but before I ask you both questions on process and your interviews and things, I'm just amazed at some, definitely not all, parallels between this event and there was a mining confrontation in West Virginia that happened in the aftermath of World War I, and they bombed, the striking miners, and there was I'm thinking about this in the context of the use of violence and the ripple effect of war, because in World War I, you have returning men who have risked so much, and they have been trained in armed methodology. And so that makes very, very potent conflicts, really challenging. And in World War II, like the return of many Blacks in the South, that was kind of the initiative of CORE and all this. So I'm going off track here, but looking from a violence perspective of how the impact of war is not just a foreign problem where people have gone off and fought and then they come back and they're just going back to lives, without armed recourse. So do both of you know the history I'm referring to?
Vaguely, I don't know enough, to sort of comment on it as an expert. But I mean, my middle name is Karl with a K after Karl Marx. I grew up with a socialist economist father, so I definitely know a lot about this sort of the history of labor movements in the country and the ways in which violence was used, on both sides, right, as a tool and a tactic. And I think what you bring up is so true about the ways in which a foreign conflict can then have these sort of ripple effects, right, from the people who bring back that sense of violence as the answer to a political problem, violence as a solution to a political problem. And you also in the sort of in World War I, there was a concerted movement from leaders within parts of the Black community to say, let's sort of pump the brakes a little bit on our agitation for expanded liberation here at home. Let's lend our support to this sort of patriotic cause of spreading, democracy across the country, and people, sort of bought into that idea that if African-American soldiers fought and risked their lives for the United States and for the cause of democracy, that would then expand democracy at home, right? And so I think, doubly, right, there are these Black men who return from war. They've been in this, many of them have been in battle, many of them have been close to battle. They've been sort of inoculated, inculcated, educated within this, militaristic way of thinking, and then you come back only to find out that was a hollow promise, right? And so you think about the ways in which that would cause people to want to stand up for their rights here, and then that was seen as a direct threat to white supremacist structures and systems, which many of the people within those were also veterans of the war and had that same sort of militaristic, education.
Yes. So much more on that level of war bringing the violence home to us and all of our problems. But if you could both talk about how you came, like your process for creating this piece, a little bit, Bayate, about your art, what was your process for creating version of telling the Tulsa story.
Yeah. Oh, I was just thinking as well, for a little bit of additional context, what Michael's referencing about a call to close ranks, that was something that was issued by W.E.B. Du Bois, who, as we'll recall, is not only one of the most famous Americans in the country at that time. They're one of the most famous Black Americans, excuse me, but also one of the most famous Americans at that time. So that was a very official, to some extent, type of call. And in regards to process, what was interesting is when we developed this episode, I was actually working on a project that examined the history of racial domestic terrorism during the World War I period, that I was doing as a series of short immersive films combined with essays and testimonials from community members, many of whom were descendants of survivors, which is a series called Red Summers VR. And we ended up actually being able to share a lot of resources from the research we were both doing. I had been doing research for a couple of years prior to the Self-Evident episode. So that was very beneficial to us in terms of sharing resources, contacts, et cetera. But the general process was to research the story, the general story, through a variety of sources available in libraries and other state, local, and federal archives, seek out a series of historic experts, historians and academics who had expert knowledge of these events, interview them and utilize those interviews as part of the narration. And then we have a collaborator called Rain Lake that's really in charge of examining the visual style that we wanted to develop and figure out how to merge that in an engaging way that's realistic, even though to a certain extent, certain things are representational because you saw some of the animations, but also help us make sure we pay the right amount of care to this subject matter. So there's a series of scripts that are written, and we discussed the visuals that go along with certain portions of the script. And then the other part is recruiting young people who have studied this and taking them through the story and seeing what their responses are so they can model how their peers would discuss them after experiencing the different portions of the episode.
So we have a lot of questions coming in. Carol Bragg wants to know, is this film being used in public schools? If so, what is the reaction of students and parents? That's one.
So I typed a response, and I'll get to that in one second. I just want to build really quickly on one of the things that Bayate was saying. For this episode, we also worked really closely with an educator and musician and poet from Tulsa, whose name is written Quincy. And so his music was featured throughout, as well as music from other artists from Tulsa. We felt that it was really important to involve people from the community that we were telling the story about. And then the other thing that, you may have picked up, you may not have picked up on is two of our voice actors were the descendants of survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre and journalists who covered the Tulsa Race Massacre. So Annalisa Brunner is the great granddaughter of Mary E. Jones Parrish, who wrote about the Tulsa Race Massacre, and Mary E. Jones Parrish's great granddaughter played the young girl who says, "Mother, I see men with guns." And then Seth Bryant is the great great grandson of A.J. Smitherman, who was also a Tulsa journalist. So that was also part of the process here, was thinking about how we could involve people who had direct connections to the story. In terms of Carol's question, our goal is to get this into as many schools as possible. Right now, we're in talks to work with PBS PBS affiliate in Virginia to get the resources into the hands of every educator in the state of Virginia, which is a huge important thing to happen right now, particularly with the election of Glenn Youngkin, who essentially got elected by fear mongering around critical race theory. So we're really trying to partner with communities in places where there is a direct pushback against the kind of history that we're trying to do. Pushback, calling it indoctrination, calling it critical race theory. And so we have a strategic plan to produce some episodes that look at the ways in which white supremacist history has been indoctrinated into our cultural air that we breathe, and that these sort of yelling and screaming about critical race theory is a direct product of the indoctrination that this country has had as history for so long. And then I see Gordon's question, about the culture of self-defense, looking at Malcolm X, right, said we're nonviolent with those who are nonviolent with us, and we defend ourselves against those who harm us, and I think that that's often been, I think I'll rewind. We're working with a scholar whose name is Kelly Carter Jackson. She's a professor at Wellesley. She wrote a book called Force and Freedom, Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence, right? And she looks at the ways in which the abolitionists over the course of the history of abolitionism saw that the institution that they were trying to end was committed to violence at every step and in every single way, and that that people could work towards a peaceful solution to a violent institution, but if the violent institution was going to be violent with them at every turn, they had to be prepared to defend themselves. And so that's, I think is this question that forever remains with us, right? Is how do we, as people who love people and humanity and want to work towards peaceful solutions and peaceful institutions, how do we deal with a system that is predicated upon violence, right? Because white supremacy is predicated in every way, shape, or form on violence. And I don't just mean violence in terms of like lynchings and shootings and fights. We're talking about violence of the soul. We're talking about a spiritual violence. We're talking about the violence on the humanity of white people who thought that it was okay for them to go to lynchings as a social event, who thought that it was an okay thing to send postcards celebrating the murder and destruction of a community. You think about the violence that does on a person's humanity. And so I don't have the answer, right, to Mr. Davis's question, or what the best sort of mixture of a culture of self-defense is with a culture of seeking peace. I'm just sort of one man with some ideas about how we can come together as humans and live in peace. Baite, do you have any thoughts on that before we look at John's question about how many episodes have been produced and then settler colonialism?
Yeah, I think as you just stated, that's the quandary and that of humanity. And I think that's one of those cases where quandary is a good word. I'm not being like overly academic with it. Because, even when you look at global events, you look at what's going on in Ukraine right now with Russia, that is a very difficult situation to resolve peaceably, because you have these two different, you have different sides with very different perspectives, in the sense that to some extent, and I'm not an expert on the issue, but I have talked with colleagues who are diplomats in the State Department, and I actually have some friends over in Ukraine because I did a show out there a couple of years ago. But you're dealing with a situation where, Russia really sees that as their territory, like that's their mentality. So they feel like they have the right to occupy that space. And that's been a conflict that stretches back hundreds of years, even thousands of years. A lot of times in the United States, we don't think of, history that's 500, 1,000 years old is relevant, but that ancient history can be very relevant. And so it's very tricky. The only thing that I could think of that can start to be a resolution to that issue is that, one, unfortunately has to be prepared to defend themselves, and hope that their preparedness to defend themselves can at least be a deterrent to violence being perpetrated against them for long enough to be able to negotiate. We talk about conflict resolution in the Kings Against Violence Initiative. And there's this idea that, conflicts get solved a few different ways. People can disengage, people can compete, and whoever wins the competition wins. And then, there's acts of diplomacy and negotiation. And so hopefully being prepared to defend oneself at least can buy us enough time, if we will, to then be able to peaceably negotiate, because violence doesn't seem like the optimal option initially for the opposing sides, but that's very hard and difficult to navigate.
So
Interject,
yeah,
sorry,
please.
Michael and Bayate, just my own perspective on this question, which will be with us. I share the view that we'll be struggling with this as long as there's conflict. What means shall we use? I think what is extraordinary when we talk about Black history in America and race relations, that out of this crucible of really profound violence leveled against Black Americans in multiple levels, emerged these examples, not perfect, of nonviolent power, where they flipped the equation, because you could say, practically speaking, they were outnumbered in arms, perhaps. So there's, a practical reality. You can only shoot for so long. But I think because of an incredible spiritual resource, and I think that what King, he's the public face of this question that we are asking ourselves as American people about violence, nonviolence, and his pursuit of let's look for a different power source led him to assess other systems of violence. His statement at the Riverside Church is just a phenomenal review of American engagement in violence at so many levels. So one effort unveiled others, if I could put it that way. And I think warriors and militarists, they have weapons and they have tactics, and of course they're in conversation with each other. Of course, we've got this approach, we've got this approach, we've got these weapon systems, Similarly with nonviolent activists. And one of the most, I would say, advanced voices in that discourse are coming from Black Americans, because they have been a reference point for other struggles. Northern Ireland cites it specifically. South Africa cites it specifically. So I do want to uphold that part of the story, because I think we can really get discouraged about the level of violence that we have in the country and the racial tension, and we have to face it, but we also have to face this goodness, this remarkable courage, this remarkable experimentation, development that happened.
And that's an excellent point. And it's also important as we're doing this to remember that, just like Black people aren't monoliths, white people weren't monoliths. And we were fortunate as a society that there were substantial portions of the white population that wasn't willing to allow this to continue in the way that was happening. Unfortunately, it seems to be, the minority to a large extent, but there were still those people. And those were people doing work that, you know, African Americans couldn't necessarily do due to their position. So I think that's another source of hope as well.
Yep. So I think just to answer some of the questions quickly that are in the chat, you know, in terms of schools, you know, where this is being used, we're fortunate to have partnerships with schools in Clayton County, Georgia, and DeKalb County, Georgia, which sort of surround Atlanta proper, Richmond, Virginia, some schools in Evanston, Illinois, schools here in Massachusetts, you know, so working with schools in a place like Georgia, in a place like Virginia, you know, that's been great. And then John asked about how many episodes we have. There are 7 that are done right now. Every episode has a suite of, you know, high resource rich follow-up activities that go with them. The 7 episodes are the Tulsa episode we just watched. There's one on Elaine, Arkansas, and Chicago, Illinois, 1919. There's one on the case of Elizabeth Key in early Virginia, which is the case that led to the law that said the status of a child is derived from the status of the mother, and led to the legacy of slavery being a lifelong, you know, perpetual status in the United States. We've got one
like, so basically it led to the 1-drop rule, to make it precise.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. And then, you know, we have one on Elizabeth Mumbet Freeman and the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts, Sojourner Truth, and the 2 public versions of her speech, which is a fascinating story. We've got one on a case in Northampton of a woman named Catherine Linda, who was brought to Northampton in 1845 by her enslavers from Savannah, Georgia, and told she could be free in Massachusetts. I feel like I'm missing one by Benjamin Banneker and his letter to Thomas Jefferson, where he wrote to Jefferson and was like, you wrote some beautiful words in the Declaration of Independence, but what about slavery? And then we have 2 that are in post-production right now. One is about Agrippa Hull and Tadeusz Kościuszko. Tadeusz Kościuszko was a Polish national who was a member of the Continental Army during the American Revolution. And when he was returning to Europe, he wrote a will that all of his American assets and property would be used to emancipate and educate enslaved people. And he named his good friend Thomas Jefferson as the executor of that will. Jefferson even went so far as to rewrite the will and say that some of that money could be used to free Jefferson's own enslaved people. And you'll probably guess, because you never heard about this, or maybe you have heard about this story, and I'm assuming you haven't, but you'll probably guess that Jefferson did not follow through on his friend's wishes and use the money to emancipate enslaved people, thus losing an opportunity to change the course of American history, and really put not his money, put his friend's money where his mouth was, right? Jefferson, you know, talked a good game about slavery and the evils of it, but when push came to shove, he didn't do it. And then, John, to your next question, the other one that's in post-production right now is called Can There Ever Really Be Justice on Stolen Land? And it looks at the 1830 Indian Removal Act and the intersections between the removal of indigenous nations from the Southeast and the then secondary trails of tears of enslaved people of African descent who get moved from tobacco country into cotton country, and then cotton becomes the predominant crop of the United States. And then throw into that already complex batch, you have the whole assimilation project, right, where indigenous nations were told by the American government all along, you know, just be like us, adopt our principles, you know, become white, and you'll be fine. You can stay where you are. And, you know, so the many members, particularly elites of what became known as the 5 civilized tribes, the way that they attempted to become civilized was to be like Southern slaveholders and enslavers. And they began enslaving people of African descent and cultivating cotton. And then when they got really, really good at it, Andrew Jackson signed the 1830 Indian Removal Act. And so doubly forced on those trails of tears, which I think we incorrectly refer to as the Trail of Tears. You say the Trail of Tears, it's a finite thing. We're talking about trails and trails and trails of tears of people removed from their ancestral homelands. And doubly forced on that, you have enslaved African people of African descent who are claimed to be owned by these indigenous elites. And then to tie that into our program from tonight, the African American community of Greenwood and Tulsa, many of the founding members of that community were the descendants of formerly enslaved people who had been brought to Indian territory as part of the Trails of Tears, right? And then they gained their freedom and went on to found Greenwood in Tulsa. And so imagine the generational trauma there, that we're talking about, this forced removal from the Southeast all the way to Indian territory. And then, less than 2 generations later, the descendants of those people founded this community that then gets destroyed in 12 hours. So in other words, we're jumping into some complex history, and we're trying to simultaneously complicate it and simplify it, right? Present it in a simplified form that, people can engage with through the power of storytelling, but presenting stories that complicate the simplistic and mythologized narratives that for so long have been at the center of our discourse.
So are there other questions? Please feel free to put them in the chat, or you can even unmute yourself if you wish, if that's simpler for those, because we're not such a huge group, so we can handle it. John Paul.
Claire,
What's the typical length of the videos?
I typoed. Oh, I two typoed. That's supposed to say shortest is 8, longest is 16. So the shortest one, it's like 8 minutes and 43 seconds. I think the Banneker one, and the Elaine, the 1919 one is like 16 minutes. We had a hard time with getting that one down. Our goal is, somewhere between like 8 and 12 is sort of the sweet spot, particularly for use in a classroom context.
So just a teaching question. Presumably this is for high school students. So when the stories are given, do they have, how do they go to the primary sources? How your high school teachers would say, here are the primary documents, and read these, read this. So how on a digital platform do students get that so that they can go back and look?
Yeah, I'm going to share my screen again one more time just to sort of show you what the platform looks like. So, this is, so for educators, who we're working with, who have full access to the entirety of the library, we'll always have some resources that are free, but, as a sort of part of our sustainability model, these episodes are really expensive to produce, and we want to make more, and we want them to be high quality. There is a subscription feature, but within the platform, if you go to the modules, this will show you, all the different modules that I talked about earlier. So let's go to this one, for example. And within the curriculum, there's the video there, so teachers can show it. There's stop points, and then there are all of these follow-up activities. So for example, this one, Into the Archives, will allow primary sources, so they're linked within this document. There's a student copy, so the teachers can link this to their students, and the students can go to it, and it's embedded. The primary sources are embedded within the assignments themselves. We're working on a plan to have sort of interactive primary sources as well on the website. So sort of artifacts that students can interact with in the digital space. And then, I think in terms of one of the things that we found, I came at this out of teaching 8th grade. And so 8th to 10th grade, 8th to 12th grade was sort of the wheelhouse in my mind as I started to build this. And Bayate really early on was like, listen, we need to make these so that they are appealing and applicable across a wide variety of audiences, right? So if a parent walks by and they see their kid watching it, they're like, ooh, what's that? That looks great. And then, you know, as we started sending around the prototypes, the early prototypes that we built, we found, you know, some of our resources. I think this one, you know, I think depending on the community that you build within your classroom and with the parents and the community in the school, you know, you can use different resources at different ages depending on how you build the community to interact with those resources, right? That being said, you know, this one I would probably recommend for, you know, 8th grade and up because of the imagery of violence. My son is in 5th grade and he's watched all of the episodes with me, but it's because he's my son and I've raised him to, you know, critically look at media and history in a certain way that I would build into my classroom as well if I were a teacher. But some of the resources we've had 3rd grade teachers use in their classrooms, you know, the Elizabeth Freeman story, the Benjamin Banneker story. Those ones have been really popular with elementary school teachers as well as with high schools. And eventually, you know, that's the big goal, is to partner with districts so they can think about all of the resources that we have and how do you use those resources across a student's entire experience within a district. And then we're also always looking to expand our audiences beyond schools, because, you know, if schools are the only place that we're doing this work, then we're missing a whole bunch of segments of society. You know, yes, it's great if we can get students while they're young and we don't have to re-educate them later or tell them these histories that they get to be, you know, our age and they're like, why did no one ever tell me that? But we want to engage with, you know, audiences of all ilks and ages.
The resources work fairly well with higher education audiences of students as well. When I've utilized them in higher ed settings, it's usually been as examples of the artistry of the work as well as to inform. So, you know, I wouldn't necessarily use the reflection points as an example of how this is a productive way of going about storytelling within a higher ed setting. But the resources do work. I'm primarily talking about the multimedia episodes, do work effectively with college age students as well.
So I have a tough question, and I'm asking both of you as teachers, because you both teach. And I suppose this comes up not just when you're teaching history of conflicts between two races, but maybe you're in Northern Ireland and you're getting, you know, Catholics and Protestants to reckon with their histories of each other. Because it's their history, you know, it's not, they're not removed from it. You're not talking about people on the other side of the ocean. What do you do with this is, I think, what's been magnified or whatever in the parent pushback, with children looking at it, and then one child, which we work at an inner city school here in Worcester, and it's predominantly children of color. And so, but this child was white, and she said, well, I just hate being white, because I think she was feeling like, I'm not sure what she was feeling. So they kind of took some of the information deeply personally on who they were. In another class, also with this school, a beautiful child, both of them beautiful, who's Black, she said, you know, well, I'm ashamed because, you know, you are ashamed of this color. So that was sort of that just came out in a circle sharing. So how do you handle that, you know, when you're sitting with young people, and of course they all look at the world in a deeply personal way. That's just what you do when you're a child. So yeah, give me your reflections on this. I'm just trading teacher notes here with you.
Yeah.
I mean, that is what you're raising, Claire, is part of the reason why there's certain suggested age for these resources. Because there's that not only correlates with a certain maturity level and experience level, but the way I would approach it would be to engage with them and discuss how the past is not a direct reflection of you if you do not choose to participate in the same mentality and ways of engaging people as the past. So one of the things I've often mentioned to folks, and I do some work across the political spectrum through some bipartisan work I do with some presidential foundations. But one of the things I've mentioned when I've gotten pushback on telling these stories from folks who tend to be more towards the political right is that, it's important to know what happened. This is not necessarily a direct reflection of anyone who's alive today, unless they choose to try to silence the telling of these stories and don't acknowledge that they're important. Because if you're alive today, you didn't do it. You weren't necessarily directly subject to the violence, but we have a responsibility of reflecting on how we utilize this information in terms of how we conduct ourselves on a daily basis. So, I would suggest kind of to kids in those circumstances, a slight reframing of the information. Because it only becomes our fault when we continue the cycle or try to silence the knowledge. And I'm pretty fortunate in a lot of the work that I do. Recently, meaning over the past 7 to 10 years, where I've gotten to a point where I don't get much institutional resistance, but a lot of that is because I have like the check boxes. So, for better or for worse, that helps. But one of the things I attempt to push institutions to do is think about what is their institutional responsibility and what do they want their legacy to be. And, when we think about 100 years ago, we had a lot of pretty prominent institutions supporting an incorrect version of US history. I'm here at Columbia now, and I'm having discussions with the deans, with the faculty about the impact of the Dunning School of Thought, right? And the impact that had. And so it's much better to be thoughtful and be on the progressive and productive end, not necessarily political spectrum, but in terms of action, productive end of addressing these issues than waiting around, not addressing them, silencing them. And then in another 100 years, you're having to explain why your scholars did X, Y, and Z that was that had a counterproductive impact. And to Columbia's credit, they are starting to attempt to address the ways in which the university has participated in certain biased and bigoted social systems that have existed in the country. But where I push institutions is, do you want to still have to do that in 100 years, or do you want to be the person who goes down in history as doing a facilitator of the right thing?
Yeah, and I think all of those great points. I mean, for those of folks in the audience who don't know, about the Dunning School, William, was that his name? William Alfred Dunning, right? Was a historian
yes, William Dunning.
At Columbia, and sort of put forth this narrative of the Civil War and Reconstruction, which stated that the failures of Reconstruction were essentially based upon Black incompetence and greed, and not white supremacist violence. And then he had a number of students who wrote similar mythologized narratives about states' rights and the causes of the lost cause, and all of this sort of cultural mythology that has stuck with us. But Claire, back to your question, it reminds me, I have lived a fortunate life in terms of the education that I have received, academically, and then also in the world. And I remember in 5th grade, we were learning a lesson on the civil rights movement, and we learned about the lunch counter protests. And I remember immediately after it, going over to a friend of mine who was Nigerian and telling her how ashamed and guilty I felt to be white. And this girl, Amara was her name, had the wisdom to tell me in that moment, right, this moment where she was like, that wasn't you. You did not do that, right? What you choose to do from this day forward is who you are. That's not you, right? So sort of dead it with that guilt shit, because that doesn't do anything for us, right? Guilt is a momentary motivating factor, right? But it's what we do after we feel that guilt that really matters. And so I think that's one thing that I would say to those students. I mean, the second thing, I think that we need to do this. We need to do an interrogation of what whiteness means, right? And we need to think about the fact that white as a category did not exist until it was needed to exist to separate people based on systems of power, hierarchy, and economics, right? That the first instance of the use of the word white is in the Virginia colony in like the late 1600s, right? It's not being used. That it comes to be used as a way to articulate a racist policy that is building. Right? It's not an articulation that then leads to the racist policies. The racist policies are building because the elites in early American colonial society need to separate those who are below them, right? And are closer to each other in societal constructs. I've heard one author talk about it as, we had a multiracial class-based coalition forming in the Virginia colony, and it was broken up to form a multi-class racial coalition, right? So we had a multiracial class-based coalition that was intentionally broken up with the invention of systemic racism and the codification of racism to create a multi-class racial coalition. And so I think that we need to interrogate what does it mean to be white, and what are the things that have been done in the name of whiteness in this country. And so I think it's right for us to be interrogating that. What it doesn't mean is that we're here to make young white children feel sad and bad about themselves, that they are somehow inherently bad or inherently evil. And that, I think, is where this dialogue often goes in these places. There, how dare you make my poor little white child feel bad, right? Well, if they feel bad hearing the history, imagine how the generations of people who lived that history felt, the people who were the targets of those histories. And then the last thing I'll say, I think that the framing of the idea of white privilege is a useful idea to explain the ways in which the physical safety of white bodies has been privileged over other bodies throughout the course of this country. The ways in which violence, and again I go back to that definition of systemic violence, right? The ways in which violence that white bodies have been privilege to avoid some of those systems of violence. But at the same time, I think that it creates this false narrative where white people become blind to the ways in which systemic racial inequity harms the vast majority of white people, right? That we are harmed in material and spiritual and ways of the soul, right? That it in so many ways. I could talk for, I could go on for an hour on this topic, but I promised my son I would go build a puzzle with him before he goes to bed. So I'm going to stop there. But I think, we really need to examine the ways in which systemic racial inequity harms white communities and white people in this country, if only for the reason of self-interest. If we can get these people to sort of act in their own self-interest, then maybe we can buy some of that time where we don't need to be prepared for violence and we can come to a peaceful solution. You like how I did that there?
I have a comment, but I want to just honor a question, one more question, which is somewhat connected. Like, have you faced, you touched on it, Bayate, but pushback from any school where you have presented this material?
Not much yet. There's a little bit of trepidation that I can feel between the lines and beneath the surface in DeKalb County, where it was very clear to me that they were sort of saying we're a little bit scared of the angry, loud, and misinformed white people who are going to scream about critical race theory. I don't want to read too much into it.
You're talking DeKalb County. Okay.
Yeah. And then I don't want to read too much into it, but I can't imagine that there's not at least some level of discussion happening around that with the work that we're trying to do in Virginia on a statewide level. They've got to, they have to be. If they're not, I'm surprised that they haven't come to me with questions about it yet. So yeah, I mean, we're waiting for it. We're ready, but I think that for us, it's we're trying to tell stories. We're trying to tell stories that are true. We're trying to tell stories that are accurate. We're trying to tell stories that have been ignored and intentionally marginalized and systemically marginalized and kept out of the discourse, and do it in a way that brings people together, right? That connects us. We want to connect and not divide. We want to correct and not mythologize.
So I really, really want to thank you very much. We have, if we can stay, those who want to stay for a few minutes can. I'm just recognizing that some people had to leave, and lots of notes of appreciation. I too could go on with this. The comment that I wanted to offer, this description of Virginia being what, multiracial and then actually being recreated to accommodate the plantation system, is for any literary people, William Faulkner's book, Absalom, Absalom. The central character is a man named Sutpen, who really literally rolls out of the hills of Appalachia into this world that is completely stratified along the lines of color and class and property ownership, actually property.
Right,
and
property is.
And he is a naive, because he has this mentality of, you ate what you shot in the mountains, and nobody understood ownership of land. Like, it was not in the consciousness of these mountain communities. So that's literature dealing with what you're describing. And my second question / comment, if it's possible, I hope someday you will tackle the story of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, which is a class and race story of
Awesome. Always looking for new stories. So.
For those unaware, it was Black and white sharecroppers organized by the communists, actually, who in Texas, segregated Texas, where you get shot even in 50 years ago, they had sundown towns, you know, where you couldn't, if you were a Black American cutting through, you couldn't be there after dark. But this was a Black and white convening of laborers, sharecroppers, often very covertly. And I think they were ultimately repressed with violence.
This is Gordon Davis. I have a question. Okay. I want to be able to contact you and your organization and get some literature or films or invite you to other forums or maybe to the school committee or something.
Awesome.
I'm going to give you my email address. Can you contact me?
Gordon, I will email you tomorrow. I got to go. I got my son waiting.
Okay.
Claire, thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
Much love to everybody. Bye, Terry Ross Smith. I love you, brother. Peace, everybody.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. And tune in March, and I hope we can stay connected with you. We've got a lot of people asking to get your
Let's
resources.
do it. Let's do it.
Enjoy
Claire, I wanted to thank you for putting this on.
Okay.
I'm Michael at selfevidentmedia.com. I put it in the chat, but email me, everybody reach out. Selfevidenteducation.com is the website. Peace.
Okay, take
Thanks
care.
for joining us, everyone.
All
Appreciate
right,
you.
thanks, Mayette. Take care. All right.